Thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you all for coming on this very hot Monday afternoon. The subject of Nazi looting has been in the news a lot lately. It seems as if every week there's some sort of new Nazi looted object that has resurfaced. There's been 2 feature films made about this subject, The Monuments Men and Women in Gold. There have been countless documentaries and books about this as well. It is a complex subject, so I'm going to attempt to demystify it a little bit by talking about theft and recovery. We're going to break the lecture up into 3 parts. So the first part will be the theft part. We'll look at how the Nazis looted art and the vast machinations that they used to carry out the looting. In the second part of the lecture, we'll look at recovery. We'll look at post-war recovery with the Allies, and then we'll look at contemporary recovery. Then, in the final part of the lecture, we're going to get personal, and I'm going to talk about a story of Nazi looted art that involved my family. Through this story, you'll be able to see all the nuances of looted art, theft, and recovery. Okay, why did the Nazis loot art? It all started at the very top with Adolf Hitler. Hitler wanted to create a monument to his legacy. He got the idea for doing this when he visited Italy on a state visit. He was always interested in art, but it wasn't until he saw these amazing museums in Rome and Florence and was in awe by the artwork that he saw there. So he decided to create a monument to his regime. What he was going to do was build a huge complex of galleries and museums. This complex would be known as the Fuhrer Museum. Hitler chose to house the museum in his hometown of Linz, Austria. Linz was a small industrial town, and it doesn't seem like it would be the ideal place to house this massive cultural monument. A more logical place would be Vienna, but Hitler hated Vienna. Vienna was the city that rejected him as an artist. He was actually a failed artist. He applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, not once, but twice, and he was rejected both times. So he wanted to diminish the cultural importance of Vienna as a city. He felt that by putting it in his hometown of Linz, that Linz would become the Third Reich's capital for the arts. And eventually, it would become the cultural capital of Europe. While Hitler applied for admission to the Vienna Academy, one of the members of the board felt sorry for him, and they told him that he had some talent in architecture, so perhaps he should go on to become an architect. He obviously never did that, but he did put his architectural training to use in that he made architectural drawings of the Fuhrer Museum. Then he got an actual architect to create a scale model, which is what you're looking at here. This picture was taken in March of 1945. Hitler committed suicide in April of 1945. So by this time, it was obvious that the Nazis were going to lose the war. But Hitler was still obsessed with the idea of creating this Fuhrer Museum. Part of this obsession as well was to fill the museum and fill it with the greatest treasures of the Western world. He hired someone for the specific purpose of acquiring art to fill the museum, a man named Hans Posse. He had credentials because he was the former director of the Dresden Gallery. And Posta's mission was to acquire art from all over Europe to fill the Fuhrer Museum. Not only that, but Hitler created a mandate telling all state and party officials that they needed to assist Dr. Posse in his mission. As a result, the Nazis looted art from every territory that they occupied. Now, this isn't anything new, looting of art. Through wars throughout history, it's always been to the victor, the spoils. Pillaging has gone on for ages. But what makes this different is that it was highly systematic. The Nazis actually had looting organizations. These organizations employed hundreds of people. There were art experts. There were people that would come in and take things out of other people's houses. There were record keepers. The Nazis kept very good records, believe it or not. And ironically, this is what the Allies used and what we use today to help find looted art. It was actually very prestigious to be a member of this organization. There were several high-ranking Nazi officials that considered themselves not just great art collectors, but art connoisseurs as well. So if you were in a looting organization and you could create a pipeline of art to the likes of Goering or Goebbels, you would be in good stead with Nazi elite. The Nazis drew up lists of what they wanted even before the war. They targeted both public and private collections, and they aimed high. They targeted the Louvre in Paris and the Rijksmuseum in Holland. In terms of private collections, they targeted families that were known throughout Europe as having amazing private collections, such as the Rothschilds and the Rosenbergs. But the Nazis didn't stop at art. They stole just about anything that you could think of. They stole books. They stole musical instruments. They stole wine. Here is a picture of bells that the Nazis stole from churches throughout Europe. Many of these bells have been damaged beyond repair because the Nazis didn't quite know how to store these. As you can see, I don't think it's a very good idea to stack bells one on top of the other. Whatever the Nazis didn't want, they sold. They sold this to fund the war effort. In fact, the Dorotea auction house in Vienna, which still exists today, was a Nazi clearinghouse. If you look at old Dorotea records from this time, you can see how the Nazis went into somebody's home. They listed everything in their house. They started with the most valuable things in the house, such as paintings or sculptures and jewelry, and they went down the list and included intimate personal items that nobody would really want to buy, such as underwear, but these were still on the list of sales. The Nazis ended up amassing hundreds and thousands of works of art, and they needed places to store all of this art. One of the key places that they chose was in the Musée des Jeux de Pomme in Paris. Have any of you been to the Jeux de Pomme? Okay. This is what it looked like when it was a Nazi repository. And if you look through this, you can almost spot the famous artist. We have a Degas over here. We have a Leger here. There's a Picasso here, and on and on. What was really interesting about this was Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring came to the Jeux de Pomme 20 times in the course of the war. Göring was an obsessive collector, but he considered himself not just a collector, a connoisseur as well. When Hitler would send in his dealers to get things, Göring liked to come in and look at the works of art and touch them and make sure that they were personally sent to his castle in Bavaria. And so here we have the head of the Luftwaffe, who should be spending his time thinking about the war, but instead he's spending an inordinate amount of time obsessing about art. As the Allies gained favor during the war, the Nazis literally went underground to hide art, and they hid art in salt mines. Believe it or not, salt mines were ideal for storing art. First of all, they were underground, so they were protected from bombing. Second of all, they were cool underground. It was cool, it was dark, it was dry. So you didn't have to worry about fluctuations in temperature or humidity, and you didn't have to worry about sunlight destroying the works of art. There are two salt mines that I want to take a look at. The first one is in Merkers, Germany. When the Allies came in here, they found art from more than a dozen German state museums. Here is a picture of General Eisenhower. Behind him is General Patton. And you can see they're looking through stolen art. This picture was taken the same day that General Eisenhower went to a concentration camp for the first time, and he became sick to his stomach. And what's really interesting about this photograph is you can see that the effects of war are actually starting to take their toll on this great general. The other thing that the Allies found in here was gold. Literally, tons and tons of gold. So if you see here, we've got some gold bars and then just bags of gold. Gold was stolen from banks. Jewelry was taken and melted down. But what was most disturbing was the Allies found bags of gold teeth from victims of the Holocaust. Okay, we're going to look at another salt mine. It is in Altaussee in Austria. This has an interesting story to it because this salt mine was rigged with explosives. The Nazis felt that if they couldn't have the art, then nobody else should have it. So they put bombs all over the entrance. We have some unlikely heroes to this story as well. Austrian miners who were part of the resistance. These miners were able to thwart the Nazis' attempts to try to bomb this or explode this until the Allies could come and save the works of art. There were some pretty amazing treasures that they found in this particular salt mine. So let's take a little journey, shall we? First, you go down a long tunnel, a whole mile deep, and what the Allies found amazed them. They found workstations for cataloging and even restoring art. And you can see on the wall just all sorts of paintings here. There's another corridor with paintings. In fact, the Allies found over 6,500 paintings. The majority of these were earmarked for the Fuhrer Museum. And I do want to look at a couple of paintings that the Allies found because they're pretty famous. Right over here, this is a Franz Hals, but it's this one I want to look at. That is called The Astronomer by Johann Vermeer. Here it is, and it's all its beautiful glory. Vermeer was a Dutch master. He only painted 34 works of art. Every single one of these is a masterpiece. Every now and again, you hear about a Vermeer being stolen, and it's a really big deal because it's a huge loss to society. And to think that that could have been destroyed is just astounding. You can visit this painting. It is in the Louvre in Paris, and honestly, the slide does not do it justice. It's really spectacular. The other famous work of art I want to look at is this. Does anybody know what those panels are from? The Ghent Altarpiece. The Ghent Altarpiece is this massive altar. It is 11 by 15 feet. In fact, here we see it. It consists of 12 panels. It's by another Dutch master named Jan van Eyck. If you look at it, you could see all sorts of nice detailing. Let's see, it was this panel, and this panel, if we go back, right there. Many people consider this to be the greatest treasure of the Western world. And it's just shocking to think that this could have been gone forever. Right, that is a bit about the theft. Now let's talk about recovery. In 1943, the Allies set up the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Unit, also known as the Monuments Men. This was set up in an effort to protect monuments from being damaged during the war. So the military recruited all sorts of art historians and architectural historians to point out monuments of cultural significance and make sure that these monuments were not destroyed during bombings. This was also done to help with the war on propaganda. The Nazis were painting the Allies as barbarians of culture. They said that the Allies would come in, the Americans in particular, and start bombing monuments that had been around for hundreds, possibly thousands of years, without a care in the world about their historical significance. The Monuments Men wanted to make sure that this didn't happen. But this wasn't without controversy. There were some monuments that were in key strategic location. So you sometimes see monuments men, bookish art historians, arguing with five-star generals. But for the most part, the art historians won out. And as a result, we still have all of these famous monuments in Europe today. The remit of the Monuments Men was extended when the war became a ground war, and it became obvious just how massive the scale of Nazi looting was. So their remit was changed to find and recover looted art. But there is another remit that they had, and you don't hear much about this in the history books, and it was to make sure that Allied soldiers didn't take anything home with them for souvenirs. So on the one hand, they're trying to return art that the Nazis looted, but on the other hand, they're trying to make sure that the Allies don't loot anything, and that did happen. The Monuments Men collected vast amounts of data, and they were astounded by just how much art was looted throughout Europe. This is one of my favorite slides. This was taken at a church in Ellingen, Germany. And here we see a soldier, and he's completely overwhelmed by these stacks of stolen art, 2 stories high. The Allies were finding repositories like this throughout Europe. In fact, they found over 1,000 repositories. So they created their own central collection point to catalog the works and try to return them. The Allies agreed that identifiable works of art should be returned to the countries from which they were taken. Here we have a picture of looted art being returned to Florence. You can see there's a bit of a celebration going on. It's just a nice day. Everybody's really happy. But this is only half the story. Once the works of art were returned to these countries, it would then be up to agencies in the countries to return the works of art to their rightful owners. This is where it gets more complicated. If the works were from a state museum, that's a lot easier because those could be returned. But if they were from a private collection, it becomes very difficult. First of all, they might not know who the works belong to, but even if they did know who the works belonged to, the odds of them actually finding that person were very low. A lot of people had fled the country, and in the worst cases, people had perished in the Holocaust. As a result, there are museums all over Europe that are holding on to what are considered heirless works of art in their museums. Okay, let's talk a bit about contemporary restitution. After the war, families filed claims for missing artworks, and it wasn't just artworks, it was real estate, it was jewelry, insurance claims were filed. This happened a lot in the 1940s, but started dying down in the 1950s. This wasn't really the priority for families. The priority was to find surviving family members and get on with their lives. The issue pretty much died down in the latter half of the 20th century until the 1990s. And then all of a sudden, there was a resurgence in interest in this subject. This had to do with more information becoming available. There are three factors that contributed to this. One was the fall of the Iron Curtain. So all of a sudden, all sorts of information from former Eastern Bloc countries was opening up. Two was that 50-year privacy laws and archives were expiring, so all sorts of archival information was becoming available. And three was the rise of the internet. So all of a sudden people were putting information online and you could do research from your computer instead of having to travel to archives. Conferences were held throughout the 1990s to talk about what to do with the outstanding looted art. This culminated in a conference that took place in Washington, D.C. in 1998 called, appropriately enough, the Washington Conference on Holocaust-Era Assets. During this conference, delegates from 44 nations got together and came up with a set of principles of how to deal with looted art. And again, they were called, appropriately enough, the Washington Conference Principles. It's a lot of text for one slide, so I will summarize it for you. Essentially, it says every effort should be made to find and return art to their pre-war owners. It gets interesting again. These principles were primarily written by the US State Department. And delegates from Europe weren't too pleased with the fact that America was telling them how to deal with European art. So in order to make sure that everybody signed these principles, they were made non-binding. So that means ethically, you should do the right thing and return looted art, but legally, you don't have to. A follow-up conference was held in Prague in 2009, where a similar set of principles was ratified by 46 nations called the Terezin Declaration. But again, these principles were non-binding. Fortunately, a substantial amount of art has been returned. But there are still thousands of works that are out there that are missing. The latest estimate is that there are 350,000 works of art that are still at large. Families are searching for them. And as I mentioned, museums throughout Europe have works in their collections that they know were looted by the Nazis. In France, for instance, in museums such as the Louvre, the Pompidou, the Dorotea, and other state museums, there are over 2,000 works of art hanging on the walls. These have an official name. They're called MNRs, or Musée National Récupération, and they're waiting for families to come in and claim them. In the meantime, they are considered heirless and the states are displaying them. Okay. So what do you do if you are a claimant and you want to search for looted art? Probably the easiest thing to do is contact a claimant organization. There are several good claimant organizations out there, and many of them are charities as well. There are also law firms that specialize in restitution of looted art. This was not a specialty 20 years ago, but as high-value works of art are being returned to families, there's a lot of money involved in this. So now there are law firms that specialize in this. If you don't want to go through a claimant organization or a law firm and do your own research, what I always tell people to do is start by getting a family history. Know what happened to your family members before the war, during the war, and after the war. Then get an idea of what objects were taken, and if you have any documentation, it helps a great deal. Documentation could be photographs, especially of the works in situ. I came across a picture of people looking for a painting, and there are these lovely elderly ladies playing cards with this beautiful painting behind them, and that did help. There are also paintings that are left to people in wills, so they're mentioned there. If they're famous works of art, they could be in catalog raisonnés, which lists works of art by a particular artist, or even past insurance claims. The other thing to do is, once you find out an object is stolen or looted, is register it on a stolen art database. The biggest stolen art database is called the Art Loss Register. And if you are a dealer or an auction house that has a good reputation, you do your due diligence and you check the Art Loss Register before you sell anything to make sure the works of art are not stolen or looted. There are lots and lots of databases of Nazi looted art now. Unfortunately, there isn't a Google for looted art, so you can't look at everything in one place. You do have to know where to look, but hopefully something like that will be imminent. And one thing you're probably thinking is, okay, let's say you put something on a stolen art database and there's a match. Then what happens? If it's from a dealer or an auction house and they're reputable, then they won't sell it. But then it becomes really, really tricky, because for the most part, the person who is putting it up for sale bought the work of art in good faith. And they feel really bad for the family that this was looted from. But they're thinking, well, yes, this is horrible, but I paid good money for this, and I had no idea it was looted. Then on the other hand, you have the family that wants to get back a piece of their heritage. So you start to talk about some sort of settlement. And settlements can be tricky, and they can take a while. Usually they take several years to try to get both parties to agree on something that they can both be happy with. Now, it is complex as searching for looted art, but it is something that happens, as is evidenced by all these cases that we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years. Okay, well, that brings us to the third part of the lecture, where I'm going to talk about a restitution case that my family was involved in. It is a work by an artist named Egon Schiele. It's called Portrait of Wally. This was a landmark case. It's changed the way that museums looted art, and it's also caused Austria to create a restitution law. This was one of the first major cases to put Nazi looting in the headlines. Prior to that, a lot of people didn't even know that the Nazis looted art. Me being one of them. I had no idea. And then when I found out that this happened to my family, I became really interested in this and started working in the field. My great-great-aunt was an art dealer in 1930s Vienna. Her name was Leah Bondi-Gere. She owned her own gallery and she championed modern art. And in many respects, it's very forward because you don't have too many female gallery owners in 1930s Vienna. And there aren't too many that champion modern art. She dealt in works by Klimt, by Schiele, and by Kokoschka. She owned quite a few works by Egon Schiele, but by far her favorite was Portrait of Wally. In 1938, in Austria, Anschluss occurred, and the fate of Jewish families changed dramatically. All Jews were ordered to give up their businesses. So my aunt had to hand her business over to a Nazi named Friedrich Welz, acquired her gallery, and he came to her house one day to get her to sign some paperwork. He saw a portrait of Wally hanging on her wall, and he said, "I want that. Give it to me." And she said, "No, you can't have it. It's mine. It has nothing to do with my gallery. It's part of my personal collection." He said, "I don't care. Give it to me." They argued for a good half hour. And finally, her husband said, "Just give it to him. You know what he's capable of." So reluctantly, she handed Wally over to him. And one of the things that he was capable of would be revoking their exit visa. So they fled for London the next day. When my aunt moved to London, she actually set up her own gallery here in London, another modern art gallery, and she was actually one of the first people credited for bringing German and Austrian Expressionism to the UK. After the war, she started searching for Wally, and she found that it was in the Belvedere Museum in Vienna. The Belvedere is the Austrian State Museum. So my aunt wrote the museum. She explained the circumstances of loss, and she asked for her painting back. What do you think the museum said? "No, you can't have this. This belongs to us." Sorry. She wrote letters. She hired lawyers, but she had no luck. In 1953, a young Viennese ophthalmologist named Rudolf Leopold sought her out in her London gallery. Leopold was obsessed with Egon Schiele. He thought that he was the reincarnation of Schiele. He touched up works by Schiele even though he didn't have any artistic training. His goal was to amass the largest collection of works by Schiele ever. He knew my aunt's reputation as a dealer in works by Egon Schiele, so he asked her to help him find works by Schiele to build his collection. She said she would, but in return, could he help her get back Portrait of Wally? He said that he would. She hadn't heard from him for a little while. Then, the next thing she knew, he ended up owning Wally. Again, she wrote letters. She hired lawyers, but to no avail. She died in 1969, having never gotten back her beloved portrait. The story's not over. Let's fast forward to 1997. By this time, Leopold had amassed the largest collection of works by Egon Schiele in the world. In fact, he has his own museum in Vienna called the Leopold Museum. Have any of you been there? Okay. In 1997, he agreed to loan several key pieces from his collection to the Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, in New York. This was a big deal. Schiele was becoming a very fashionable artist by then, and this was the first time that so many works by Schiele would be seen on that side of the Atlantic. So it helped to raise Schiele's reputation as well as the worth of the Leopold collection. Several key pieces included Portrait of Wally. There was another piece called Dead City. All sorts of amazing works were going to be seen for the first time. Our family decided the best thing to do was to talk to the press about how Leopold acquired works of art in his collection. Portrait of Wally was not the only looted work of art in his collection, and Leopold used less than upstanding methods to acquire a lot of works. So we spoke to a reporter from the New York Times, and she ended up writing this big article about how Leopold used dastardly methods to acquire works of art. They interviewed my family. They focused on two paintings, Portrait of Wally and Dead City. When the article came out, it caused a sensation. Citizens of New York, Jewish citizens in particular, were aghast that MoMA would harbor Nazi loot. So we took this opportunity to contact the chair of the Museum of Modern Art to see if he could keep Wally in America before it went on to its next stop in the exhibition, which was Barcelona. We knew that if it left America and we couldn't prove the ownership in America, we would never get it back. The chairman for the Museum of Modern Art at the time is a man named Ronald Lauder. You might not have heard of him, but you have heard of his mother, Estee Lauder. Ronald Lauder has a lot of ties to Austria. He was the Austrian ambassador in the 1980s. He was also, or is also, an avid collector of Austrian expressionist art, such as Klimt and Schiele. In fact, the rumor is that he used his bar mitzvah money to buy an Egon Schiele painting. Not only that, but he chairs a recovery company that helps Jewish families get back works of looted art. So we thought he would be sympathetic to our plight. But guess what? He wouldn't help us. He was indebted to the museum community and making sure that this work went to its next stop on the exhibit. While this was going on, museums were taking notice of this. In fact, all sorts of museums wrote a joint letter saying that MoMA had to move this painting to its next stop in the exhibition. This is because museums were realizing that if this work stayed in America and there was an investigation into the provenance or ownership history of the work of art, if they loaned works abroad, other families could claim for looted art as well. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Museums do not like to give back works of art from their collections. My feeling is if these museums consider themselves paragons of culture, they wouldn't want stolen or looted art in their collections in the first place. But that was not the way that these museums felt at the time. We spoke to lawyers, we spoke to government organizations about keeping the work in the country, and they were all trying to help us, but things were looking bleak. In fact, Wally was getting packed up and it was getting ready to be shipped off. But at the 11th hour, the Manhattan District Attorney swooped in and subpoenaed the painting under the U.S. Stolen Property Act. As you could well imagine, officials at MoMA were livid. Officials at the Leopold Museum were livid. A lawsuit ensued. Now, during this lawsuit, a couple of interesting things happened. Museums began looking through artworks in their collections and looking for gaps in, again, the provenance or ownership history from the years 1933 to 1945. And they would place these works online so that people could begin researching them. The other thing that happened was that Austria was getting a bit of a bad reputation for having looted art. And the culture minister, in her knowledge and wiseness, decided that this was just really not a good way for Austria to be perceived and wanted to make a big gesture. So they ended up writing a law saying that works of art that were looted by the Nazis that were in Austrian museums would be returned. Unfortunately, Wally was exempt from that because the Leopold Museum was not fully a state museum. So this lawsuit went on for 12 long years. Finally, in June of 2010, we came up with a settlement. The Leopold Museum ended up paying our family $19 million for the painting, which was the market price at the time. And they would get to display it again in the Leopold Museum, but there would be a plaque next to it stating the ownership history and my aunt's role in it. Just a couple of other pictures. This is Egon Schiele's self-portrait with Chinese red lanterns, and this was what he painted as a companion piece to Portrait of Wally. Those two are now hanging together in the Leopold Museum. And this is a painting of my aunt by a Hungarian artist named Felix Harta. In talking to family members, the general consensus is if she'd known all the fuss made over her little painting, she would have laughed and laughed. All right, well, that is a lecture. Hopefully I've helped to demystify this a little bit, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if this has, immediately what comes to mind is art that's been sort of looted through the centuries, through war, basically everything in the Louvre.
And the British Museum.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering if this, I mean, I understand this is more recent. It's probably, a different set of circumstances to a degree, but I would imagine this is also impacting norms for those works of art. So just wondering if you can talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, in the UK, for example, it is illegal to deaccession works of art from museums. So that means you can't give them back unless there's an act of parliament, which is why the Elgin marbles have not been given back. There has been an exception for Holocaust looted art, in which you can give it back. They put a sunset clause in it, which is going to be ending very soon. You might have even seen that in the news. Somebody's government official said that they were not going to put a sunset clause in it. There won't be a statute of limitations, but somebody's trying to block that. And this seems to be the case with a lot of museums throughout Europe.
Are there any rules on when claimants are trying to claim any artwork back on their what they wish to do with the art going forward, if that makes sense?
Yeah. My feeling is once they get the art back, they could do whatever they want. Sometimes it's part of a settlement. And a lot of people think, well, you fight so long and so hard to give back or get back these works of art. Why are you then turning around and selling them? There are a couple of reasons for that. One is because oftentimes it's just one work of art, and there are a lot of heirs. You can't divide up a work of art, but you can divide up money. Two is that if it is a work of art worth a lot of money, a lot of families can't even afford the insurance on the art. But my feeling is once they get it back, they can do whatever they want with it.
Does that even mean? Does that even mean if they want to keep it in their private collection, then that there aren't any rules on that either?
Absolutely. They could do whatever they want with it. They could keep it in their private collection. They could give it away. They could hide it in a vault somewhere. It's theirs.
I'll ask a question. Are there differences between art that was looted sort of by individuals and that was sort of in the more sort of state-sponsored looting? In terms of recovery, are there big differences in the way you see people trying to provide evidence? It must be much more difficult when it was a person who just saw something they liked and took it off the wall, and it didn't go into the sort of Nazi administration system.
Yeah, oftentimes it is a lot easier when it is something that's gone through the state system than when it's a person. And the rules and laws for the countries are different. So somebody might be living in one country and find a work of art that's in another country, and you're dealing with different laws in each country. So that's where it gets very tricky and very complicated. And it's like that with individuals versus states as well.
Hi, thanks. That was really, really interesting. It sounds like there was an opportunity at, back in the past from your slides, where the international community could have come together and made binding rules and didn't do so. And then you gave a couple of examples how individual countries created rather restricting rules on actually preventing maybe this happening, even in the Austrian example where there's a loophole in there that prevented. Are there any plans to create sort of more international binding rules? And if not, do you have any hope that there will be?
Funny you should ask that. I was at a conference in September here in London, and there were government officials from, Austria, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK. Somebody brought up the question of, are we going to make the Washington Conference principles binding? They couldn't say no fast enough. And there were actually legitimate reasons for that. It's good to have this as a framework, but then each country has its own laws, and they want to work within their own laws. But in terms of making some sort of binding legislation, I don't hold out much hope for that.
Hi there. When was the last time a large, shipment or amount of artwork has been found in caves? Because you read a lot in the news that people think they found the Amber Room and they're in the mines somewhere in Germany. But has there been recently in the past 5 years, are people still finding salt mines worth of artwork? And do you have any hope that they're still out there?
You hear about Nazi trains, but for the most part, those end up being false. The last big stack of looted art that was discovered was in 2012, I believe, with the Gurlitt collection. Have you heard about that? Cornelius Gurlitt was the son of a notorious Nazi dealer. German customs officials were wondering why he had so much money when they saw him on a train. They went to his flat in Munich, and they found over 1,200 works of art in his flat in Munich. That was probably the last massive haul that was found.
What sort of conditions are those?
They're in pretty good condition. In fact, they are on exhibit right now. There's 2 exhibits going on. There's one in Bern because for some convoluted reason, Gurlitt passed away and he left all these works to the Kunstmuseum Bern. So Bern's doing an exhibition now. And there's also one that I believe just closed in Bonn, Germany, but it's going to reopen in Berlin in September if you wanted to visit them. The hope is that families will come forward and claim these works of art. So we'll see. Some are very valuable, some aren't that valuable. But it did cause a huge stir when this came up. And there are also restitution researchers in Germany who are going through the provenance of all of these objects, trying to determine whether or not they're looted, because Gurlitt said that none of these were looted and they were all acquired legitimately. And there have been a few claims made on them, and people have gotten back works of art from there.
I was just wondering if there's maybe a positive or negative correlation between the type of artist versus a gallery looking to recover a certain type of artist. Does that have a positive effect or a negative effect, would you say?
It seems like there are some artists that tend to be looted more than others. Most of them would be modern artists such as Klimt and Schiele. And it depends on who you're talking to as to whether or not it's a positive or negative effect. And how many of you have seen the movie Women in Gold with the Klimt painting that was restituted to the era of Adela Bloch-Bauer? That was a really positive effect for the family and for the lawyer that worked with her, but it had a really negative effect on the Belvedere, which had to give all these works back. So I think it really depends on who you're talking to.
Were the works that Hitler was collecting, were they the same ones that he was sort of condemning as degenerate?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, the works that Hitler were condemning as degenerate were either going to be destroyed, but fortunately the Nazis realized, oh, hey, we can sell these works of art. The types of work that Hitler and by association the Nazis liked were Renaissance works, works that were ancient Greek or ancient Roman. You could show nudity, but it would have to be nudity without sensuality. So they were much more provincial type of works.
So was Sheila one of the degenerates?
No, Sheila would
Oh.
have been a degenerate,
Oh, okay.
big time.
So-
Sheila, Klimt, Kokoschka, Picasso, Chagall, they were all considered degenerate artists, and I could give a whole other lecture on that.
Okay, well, so Hitler was condemning all of those as degenerates, and yet all of his sort of high-ranking sort of officials were collecting them on the side?
Some were. It's always more complicated than that. Some were collecting modern art, some were big fans of modern art, but when the decrees went down that this type of modern art was labeled degenerate, the Nazis couldn't openly collect that.
Interesting. Thank you.
I think with that we'll close. Thank you so much, Shauna. That was fascinating.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.